Welcome to the Varsity Edge. If you're here, you're looking to make the biggest leap in your career, the transition from being a coordinator or an assistant coach to securing your first head football coaching position. Over your career, you've learned the X's and O's, but the job you're truly applying for is not about your scheme. It's about being the CEO of the largest moneymaker in high school athletics and what many consider to be the front porch of your school and community, the entire varsity football program. For your first job, your administrative competence is your greatest asset. We're going to give you the blueprint for 70% of the job that they don't teach you. We'll break down your candidacy into three essential pillars: foundation, strategic search, and the close. I appreciate you joining me here on YouTube for this course. And this is Coach Coltharp, and I'm really excited for you to learn the Varsity Edge. And I'm going to teach you the blueprint to landing your first head coaching job. Let's dive into Module 1, building your foundation. That committee is going to want to know, can you manage the program at large? And so much about being a head coach is not about football, it's about man management, whether you're talking about coaches or players. And so let's talk a little bit about some strategies that you can put in place to help you manage those players. And the one thing that we talk about a lot in the managing off-season book is building accountability and leadership and culture. And so one of those ways is to develop what we call the unit system. And it's designed to create player buy-in. A head coach can't manage 100 players alone. I mean, much less 60. I mean, a lot of you guys are working at small schools and things like that nature. But you need a tiered leadership structure, or what we call the unit system. This system is how a new head coach maintains order and consistency from day one. You can't just name captains. You got to train them. And I think that's a common misconception, is that you can't teach leadership. You can't teach culture. A lot of old school coaches would be like, "Oh man, he's just not a leader." Well, I mean, what did you teach him? Did you teach him how to be a leader? Um, that's what courses like this and books and culture books like Randy Jackson's Culture Over Leadership, Culture Over Schemes type books. So those things are great. Brian Kane, the Coffee Bean, all those kind of leadership books. If you're not reading those kind of things, man, you need to start, because you can get a nugget from all of them, no matter what the area. But you are you training up your captains? You want to select 8 to 12 seniors. You want to form some kind of leadership council, and their job is not to coach, it's to enforce culture and to manage. And one of the things we talk about in the winning the football offseason or mastering offseason football is that you want to go from a coach-led program to a player-led program. And this is one of the ways that you do it. These accountability groups, each person on your leadership council has an accountability unit of 8 to 10 players. And of course, we're just assuming you have a program of 100 players. And this is where attendance, equipment care, and academic follow-up happen. If somebody's not doing good, their leader's going to say, "Hey, man, look, I'm going to need you to make sure you go into class. And I heard you got in trouble in so-and-so's class the other day, man. Coach is going to get on us, man. We got to do that." There's no pressure, better pressure than peer pressure. And when the unit system works, your seniors are managing 80% of the minor issues, freeing you up to focus on strategy and things of that nature. Fundraising, things that you really need to be doing instead of dealing with the minor stuff. It kind of also standardizes your discipline. Shows your administrators that discipline is based on policy, not personality. So it's so hard sometimes not to be reactive in those situations. Just have that policy put in place. The freshman of the C team has got to face the same exact consequences for a violation as a star quarterback. I mean, that level of consistency is what separates toxic programs from elite ones. And, it's going to build that trust, which is so important. Kind of the next idea is that you want to become that hallway recruiter. And I can't tell you how far this really goes. Like, one of the most important days as a new head football coach is the first faculty meeting that you attend after you've been appointed, whether that's in the middle of the year, like you came over in the, after Christmas. A lot of guys get jobs in January and February, those kind of things. Or if it's that first meeting in August, and that's where you stand up and you say, hey, I'm Coach so-and-so. I'm really excited to be here. And I just want you to know that if you're having any issues with any of my guys, if you'll let me know, I'll be your number one fan, whether it's academics, discipline, those kind of things. My expectation for them is for them to sit in the front of the room, to be attentive and to be an integral part of your classroom environment. And if they're not upholding those expectations, shoot me an email or whatever I need to do, and I'll do whatever I can to help you get that fixed. That little speech right there goes a long way. And, so being that hallway recruiter is so important. And the hallway, there's a lot of different people in the hallway. Now, it's not just players. Okay, you got teachers, you got administrators and those kind of things. And that visibility is your biggest currency. And for a first time head coach, gaining that administrative support is vital. Administrators support coaches who support the school. Be a part of the culture. Okay, you can't just be football and everybody else. You need to be at basketball games. You need to show up at a baseball game, a track meet, show up at a softball game, or yes, and even a soccer game. Show up and be around and let people know that you're not just the head football coach, but you're a part of that school community, and that is very important. Being visible, active, and it lets people know that you're excited about not only being the head football coach, but being a respected faculty member as well. And if those teachers get on your side, they're going to help you with things like retention. You're not going to lose as many kids to discipline and eligibility because a teacher's going to email you and say, hey, look, man, Johnny's not been doing his work. He's in trouble of failing, and I need you to talk to him. And they'll flag those kids for you real quick because, to be fair, they love it. On homecoming, when a kid says, hey, Miss Jones, will you wear my jersey on Friday? And they like those kind of things. And it's a part of when they know that you got their back. More often than not, they're going to have yours. A lot of teachers are going to be like, hey, man, have you met Coach so-and-so? Have you thought about playing football? I really like him. He's exciting. Maybe you should think about doing it. So they can encourage, multi-sport athletes to join the program if they hadn't played before. And then the biggest thing is you're gaining capital with your principal. Your principal sees you as an asset to the entire student body, not just the football team. The football coaches in the cafeteria, well, number one, people ain't going to cut up because you're standing in there and you're talking to kids that normally people wouldn't talk to. And that's a thing. And you really, and here's the big takeaway of that. You can't act like you're just being bothered to do those kind of things. You got to look like you want to do them, and you should want to do them if you really, really want to make a difference and to change the culture. Because to be fair, very few of us get an opportunity to go to a place that's already working great. So take that opportunity, get that visibility, pull up that currency with your admin, because you'll need to cash it in later. The last little piece of module 2 that we're going to talk about is developing this idea of the CEO resume. Okay. So many young coaches walk into these interviews and they think that their people are actually going to talk to them about football, and they come out of there, with their heads spinning. They got these, I remember one time a guy showed me his interview packet, and I mean, it was impressive. I mean, it was professionally bound and had all this stuff. I mean, but like 75% of it was plays. Like, he had his whole playbook in there. And I was like, dude, nobody's going to look at that. He's like, what are you talking about? I was like, well, first of all, do you even know who's on your committee? And that's a big thing. If you can find out how many people are on the committee and kind of who it is, generally speaking, it's going to be your AD. It's going to be the principal, maybe an assistant principal. You'll have one teacher, it'll be a veteran teacher, maybe the chairman of whatever department that you're going into as a teacher. If you're PE, it'll be maybe the chair of the PE department. Maybe the basketball coach, that kind of thing. I've been on interviews where I've had students in my interview, players, student athletes that were asking questions and different things like that. So you never know. But if you can find out, that's really, really important. But you got to realize, especially if you're brand new, I was 26 when I got my first head coaching job, and I wish I would have had this course back then. Would have made my life so much easier. But the most critical step for an aspiring head coach, especially if you don't have head coaching experience, is that don't just list coaching tasks. Okay, make yourself look like that person that these administrators are wanting to hire, because the person they want is a manager, a finance director, a public relations specialist. You got to go in there and be able to quantify your administrative competence. So you want to shift from task to impact. And sometimes you got to be creative to make that sound right. But a task list would be like, hey, I coached the offensive line. A strong impact type thing would be, hey, I managed a $25,000 operational budget and reduced equipment loss by 15%. Well, what that really meant is that you were in charge of equipment. Every assistant has a deal. One guy does recruiting, one guy does equipment, one guy does this. You were over equipment. So yeah, instead of saying, hey, I coached the OL and I was the equipment manager, no, you looked at how many helmets you needed. You set up a system so where when you took up equipment, it was accounted for, you didn't lose stuff. It's just how you write it. I ran practice drills. Well, no, you developed a documented 4-step conflict resolution protocol for player to player issues. You're talking about, hey, man, listen, Johnny and Peter don't get along. So, no, we didn't do bull in the ring, but we did pull them aside. We talked to them about this. So you want to make it look like that you're a problem solver, you're a manager. It's really, really important. And when you do your portfolio, you want to do a philosophy statement, a discipline statement, a budget outline. Don't just show up with a laminated depth chart. I mean, that makes you look like a coordinator. You need to show up with a budget plan. I mean, things that you think you might need, those kind of things. And that way you look like a CEO. And that's kind of what you really are. And if everybody thinks they can do the gig, and then when they get into the gig, they realize the gig ain't what they thought it was. They thought it was just calling plays and being the dude that looked important, but you don't realize the stress that's involved with being a head coach. So that kind of concludes module 1. Like I said, this course is designed to be short and sweet, just to kind of give you some little bitty ideas. In the book, we cover this stuff, way more in depth. The book's over 100 pages long. So once again, the link will be in the video below, and I'll see you in module 2. All right, coach, welcome to module 2 of the Varsity Edge, your blueprint to getting the head coaching job. This is Coach Coltharp coming to you again. And in this module, we're going to talk about the strategic search, how to pick what jobs you want to apply for, what kind of homework you need to do before you go into the interview and things of that nature. As always, this is a short mini course that's kind of based on my book of the same title, The Varsity Edge. It's supposed to come out here in the next couple of weeks, scheduled for 12/12/25, but I may get it done early. So if it comes out early, check that out, and I'll tweet that and do all the good stuff. But the link to the book will be in the description of the video. So let's jump into the video and talk about the strategic search. Strategy is customized. The strategic search is about doing your homework. Since you're applying for your first head coaching job, you can't afford a generic application. The head coach candidate sends a tailored blueprint. Before you apply, you must know what you're walking into. This is where you determine if the job is a sustain or a rebuild. For a first-time coach, understanding this is a key to setting realistic expectations and tailoring your pitch. For many years, every job I applied for was a rebuild, and I got really, really good at it because I knew what it took to fix. And then a lot of times when you get a job that's a rebuild, long-term success is very difficult because of various things, whether it's finances, demographics, frequent changes in administration, and so on and so forth. But that's a whole nother conversation. But the first thing you want to look at is when you're doing this program health analysis, you're doing this due diligence. Is this a job that you really want? And look, there's two types of jobs. There are guys who want to go They'll want to be a head coach at all costs, and they'll take any job. And sometimes you're going to take a job and it's a career ender. You're going to get one shot, and the job is so hard that you're not going to be very successful, and you may not get another shot. And that's why due diligence is so important. So the first thing you want to do is look at the financial engine. Is the program funded primarily by the district or by the booster club? High booster alliance means you need an elite fundraising strategy, not just a great defense. So that's very, very important. And then the other part of that is what are you going to do to keep those boosters happy? What's the staff and enrollment? What's the staff turnover rate? How many teachers are coming and going? Those kind of things. How many coaches have they had in the last 10 years? I mean, that tells you a lot about the school and the community. High turnover signals a toxic culture or an overbearing AD. Is the school's general enrollment shrinking or growing? This tells you a lot about the talent pool for the next, 4 years. The predecessor. Why did the last coach leave? If it was forced, the administration wants stability and liability controlled. If they retired, they want a seamless transition. Tailor your narrative to the administrator's core pain point. Next, you want to look at your operations manual. This is the document that wins the job for a first-time applicant. It proves that you thought past week one. This manual is your administrative resume. And remember, we talk about that CEO resume, and this is how you put it together. The first thing you want to look at is your staff organizational chart. Go beyond offensive and defensive coordinators. Show dedicated roles for academic coordinators, somebody who's going to track eligibility, equipment manager who deals with inventory and safety, video coordinator, huddle technology. And I would also include the role that the athletic trainer is going to play in your total program. And this proves you prioritize logistics and safety. Have a yearly timeline. Show a detailed 12-month calendar. When does fundraising happen? When is the facility deep cleaned? When are parents' meetings held? These are all really, really important type things, and it shows that you can have a framework for the big picture. Facility and equipment plan. Outline a 3-year plan for helmet replacement. That's huge these days, especially with the 10-year rule and the cost. And you never know how many you're going to lose in reconditioning. So you want to get on a buy plan. So where if you buy 10 and you lose 3, you're plus 7. What do you got to do to keep your numbers right? Field maintenance, uniform turnover. Find out if you're on a 4 or 5 year rotation. A lot of schools are on a 4 or 5 year rotation uniform wise, but this shows that you understand risk mitigation. It shows that you understand how important that is, and that you're thinking about money and operations. And then lastly, kind of what are your essential fundraising strategies? Every AD is going to want to know, how are you going to raise money? And your answer must be strategic, demonstrating you can handle the budget without prior head coaching experience. And this is where I would say tap into fundraisers that you've been a part of as a player, as an assistant, as other people have looked at. This is where you do online research and you talk to guys and say, hey, what have you done to raise money? Things like reverse raffles, bowling tournaments, golf tournaments, gold cards, all those kind of different things that people do to raise money. Cow pie bingo. I mean, I've seen golf ball drops from helicopters. I mean, this is all kind of crazy stuff. But booster boundaries, formalize the bylaws, understand what the booster club role is. The head coach manages the program, the booster club manages the money. And those clear boundaries prevent interference and liability issues. I had a situation where I was a head football coach and the athletic director, but my rule was no coach went to the booster club without going through me. Only the AD would make money requests to the booster club. And that way I was able to see who was doing what. Some schools have single sport booster clubs. Some schools have total athletic booster clubs, but understanding the framework of that booster club is really important. And those are things that you can kind of ask about informally. But if you're not sure, these are things you definitely need to ask about during the interview process. come up with sponsorship tiers, professional tiered pitch decked for local businesses, gold, silver, bronze, what offer tangible return on investment, social media mentions, banners. I already have a plan for that. Hey, these are how I'm going to approach sponsors. This is how we're going to raise money. These are the things that I want to do. And they may already be doing these things, but the fact that you're thinking about these things make it really, really important. And then, what are your high return events? Focused on low overhead, high impact events like lift-a-thons. Penny a pound goes a long way. Each kid raising, $25 and you got 100 kids, that's 2,500 bucks. That's amazing. And then you're also connecting, kind of your physical development to fundraising goals. So, just kind of going back through it, you're definitely in this module, and you're thinking about that strategic search. What's the program health? Is the population going up, going down? What's going on in the community? Is the community thriving? Is the community dying? Is the community stagnant? Are a lot of kids living with their grandparents? Are people coming and going? All these things are kind of important. What's the past 10 years of the school? How many head coaches have they had? Why did the guy who was there before, why is he leaving? And then, of course, developing your operation manual and things of that nature. These are all things that you need to think about as you prepare to apply for these jobs, so that when you walk into to the interview process, you have a good idea of what you're getting into and whether this is a job that it's worth you going after. Because, like I said, there are some jobs that you only go after if you just are dead set that you want to be a head coach and you don't care about the rest. And when that happens, more often than not, it's more detrimental to your career than it is creating growth. All right, Coach, welcome to Module 3 of the Varsity Edge, your blueprint to landing the head coaching job. This is Coach Coltharp again. And in Module 3, we're going to talk about the close. And, the goal of this module is to master the interview and negotiate for program success. And, once again, this is a mini course here on YouTube just to kind of give you an overview of things that you need to do to get yourself that first head coaching job. Obviously, I've written an extensive book through a lot of different research methodologies that I think shares a lot of great information. I'll put a link to that book. The book is titled The Varsity Edge. Just like the course, it's supposed to drop 12/12/25, but I think it may be ready a little bit earlier. So check back on that, check that link, and if you would, drop a like on the course and share it so people can, kind of see what we're putting together. So let's jump into Module 3. So you've built your systems and you've done the research, and now you have to win the room. The interview is the sales presentation, and you got to know your audience. The biggest thing about that is most interviews that I've ever been on have been very, very similar. It's going to be some kind of panel, but you have to understand all panels aren't created equal. There are people on the panel that are there to keep peace in the building, to make them think that they have some kind of decision making authority, and then there are people on the panel who really have decision-making authority. One of the biggest, worst kept secrets in the history of the world is that ADs do not hire and fire football coaches, principals do. So, the principal is obviously going to be the number one person in the room. The AD will have, depending on the structure of your school system, if the AD is just, a random coach on staff, they won't have as much pull as if the AD is also an administrator. I've been in several interviews where they had a person from the county central office there, whether that person was over athletics or county AD or something like that. I've had those kind of people in there before. Booster club people. I've had parents. I've had teachers, department chairs and things of that nature. And that's where the school politics kind of comes in. I've actually had student athletes in my interviews as well. So, you just kind of never know, but you have to know when you fill in the room, Yeah, who's who and what's what. And that goes back to what we talked about in module 2 about doing your due diligence, had touching base with the AD before you show up to find out how many people is going to be on the interview committee, and as close as you can get to knowing who those people are. So you're gonna face this multi panel interview, and you got to tailor your message to each of the stakeholders. Obviously, when you're talking to the principal, they have three main goals: liability, safety, and eligibility. They academics is their number one thing. Making sure kids are safe and taken care of. Things as simple as not leaving campus until the last kid's picked up, which can be kind of a headache. Making sure that you're being safe in practice and not doing crazy things, making sure everybody has the correct equipment. These are kind of things that principals care about. When you answer questions, you want to make sure that you have a structure that shows that you have these things in mind, and that you're gonna put him at his least amount of risk. And obviously, principals want to win. One of the questions I always ask when they ask me is, um, "Do you have any questions for us?" It's always, "Well, define success." How do you define if the football team is successful? That tells you a lot about where the principal's at. So that's kind of a nugget that I would share with you on that one. ADs care about competence and maintenance. They want to know that the sport, can run a program, and that you're going to be the least amount of headaches. ADs have enough headaches as it is. I spent some time as an AD, and I promise you, dealing with cheerleaders and finding a bus for cross country on a Tuesday when the golf team has to have a bus to go somewhere, and then volleyball, the nets are broke all at the same time. Those are things that they're dealing with in the fall. The last thing they need is a major blow up in the football program. So that's kind of where they are. Your parent and community members, they're going to want to gauge how you communicate, how you define fairness. And I think this is where you come back in and you kind of reiterate your policy, not personality. Policy over personality when you're doing discipline and things like that. You're going to get parent politic questions. How do you handle an angry parent demanding playing time? And that's kind of where you say, hey, look, my policy is posted publicly. Playing time decisions are based on published measurable metrics, performance and practice, attendance, and compliance with the code of conduct. If a parent has a question, I will point them back to the policy. And you can say it like that. And my always answer was, is really don't discuss playing time with just a parent. If a parent wants to talk about why a kid isn't playing, they got to bring the kid into the meeting with them. You bring your son into the meeting with me, and let's let him tell you why he's not playing. And then we never talk about other people's children. We're not going to compare Johnny to Sam and these kind of things. And we're not going to talk about Sam, but we're going to talk about what Johnny's doing. What did Johnny do in the off season? What's Johnny doing in season? Why Johnny's not playing? Because Johnny can't act right in school. But Johnny's going to sit in that meeting with that parent and explain to them, why playing time is. And generally speaking, when you say, yeah, I'll meet with you and Johnny, parent usually doesn't want to meet. Behavioral questions, they require a structured answer for a first time head coach. This is how you turn assistant experiences into proof of head coach readiness. You kind of use that STAR method every time, situation, task, action, result. So in that situation and task, briefly set the scene of your responsibility. Hey, star player, was late showing up for a playoff game, etc. Those kind of things. Detail the specific steps you took. Use I, not we. I referred to our written code of conduct, which states quantify the positive outcome. The player accepted the consequences and GPA improved by 0.5 points that semester. Just whatever you're dealing with. But if you use that STAR method, it usually comes out on the good end. The results show leadership, adherence to policy, and a positive impact on the student athlete. And I think that's usually a win-win for everybody. And then this last part, we're talking about negotiating for program success. They're going to offer you the job, and they'll call and offer you, and that's where you always say, well, listen, I'm super interested, but I would love to come sit down with you and talk about it in more detail. And you, generally speaking, that's just going to be you and the principal and maybe the AD. And this is where kind of the rubber meets the road. Now, and some of these things you can do, and some of them you can't. It just depends on where you are, but it never hurts to ask. You know, how much are the assistants paid? Um, if it's a school based number, always argue for more money for your assistants. Before you argue for yourself. Better paid staff means better talent, better supervision, less liability. And that also proves to the AD that your priority is program safety and excellence. I went to a place one time where they gave me there was an allocation for how much the assistants were made, and it was funny because we had a guy on the staff who had been a head coach in another state and won a bunch of games, and he was just kind of like double dipping, and he was an assistant, and he was making less assistant coach money than a kid who had graduated from the high school and was in his second year coaching. And I was like, that's crazy, but that was that Nepo money type thing. So what I did is I went in there and made everybody the same based on how many years they had. And then actually that guy became my highest paid assistant. Um, you know, Things like dedicated equipment budget, facility usage rights, those kind of things, they demonstrate long-term commitments. I always ask for, hey, I'd like to go to a clinic every year. Will you guys pay for it? These kind of things, and, just all the kind of things that you can kind of write down and think of. Um, and then, after the final proposal, send a little mini proposal. Thank you. This is a Bruce note that reiterates two key solutions you offered. I will begin with helmet audit Monday, and my first parent meeting will be next Tuesday. This shows you are ready to work immediately, and I think that's really, really important. Um, now, kind of in conclusion, let's talk about what you do after you get the job. Your first 100 days, congratulations, you're now the new head football coach. One of my mentors told me when I got my first job, he said, congratulations, boy, you've now enjoyed your last football practice. Oh, was he never telling the bigger truth? Your first 100 days are entirely dedicated to implementation, not to X's and O's. Your first week, you want to do, finalize and onboard your staff as fast as you can get them. And there's a common misconception that, oh yeah, I'm gonna hire and fire these guys and bring, I think the most I've ever been able to bring to a new school is maybe one or two. So you're going to have to meet with the guys who are there and quickly gauge, where they are and what their desires are and all those kind of things. And we talk more about that in the book. So if you want to go more in depth in that, pick up a copy of the book. You want to conduct a full facility and equipment safety audit. Go see how many helmets you got. Get the if you're a mid-year hire, which most of us are when we get our jobs, you want to see if reconditioning has been done. If not, you want to get that done as quickly as possible. Schedule your meet the coach night for all the parents and stakeholders. Your path is set. You're no longer the coordinator, you're the CEO. So you have to go secure that edge and give yourself the foundation for a great start.